Have you ever wondered where a Nobel Prize-winning medical discovery actually begins? We picture these massive, gleaming laboratories, tons of complex experiments, but the truth is, the spark that ignites a revolution in medicine, it often starts in a much quieter, more ordinary place. So let's dive in and see how that process really works.
Think about it. When a new, totally baffling illness appears, or when a common disease suddenly starts acting in a weird way, where do doctors even begin to figure it out? It's really a lot like a detective story, where those very first clues are absolutely everything.
And just like in any good mystery, the story doesn't kick off in some high-tech forensics lab surrounded by expensive gear. Nope. In fact, some of the biggest, most important discoveries in medical history began far, far away from a research bench. They started right in a doctor's office or at a patient's bedside.
That's right. It all begins with one doctor looking at one patient and just noticing something unusual, something that doesn't quite fit what the textbooks say. This single, careful observation is the absolute heart of medical progress. And today, we're going to break down exactly how that tiny spark becomes a full-blown flame.
So our medical detective story kicks off with the very first piece of evidence. This is the foundational document of medical discovery, and it's called a case report. This is where a doctor first puts pen to paper, so to speak, and says, "Whoa, wait a minute, I have never seen this before."
So what is a case report? Well, it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like, a super detailed, comprehensive story all about a single patient. It's written to document something unique, maybe an unexpected side effect from a drug, a really surprising way a known disease is showing up, or heck, even what looks like a brand new condition. It's just one data point, sure, but it's an incredibly rich one.
And the key phrase here is comprehensive and detailed description. See, the goal isn't to prove anything at this stage, not at all. The goal is simply to document everything. Every symptom, every lab result, how the patient responded to treatment. This detailed record is so crucial because it lets other doctors out there read it and maybe, just maybe, recognize a similar case in their own practice.
To stick with our detective analogy, the case report is like that initial field report from the first detective on the scene. They're describing everything in incredible detail. The weird mark on the wall, the clock that stopped at 3:15, all of it. They don't know what it all means yet, but they know it's important to get it all down. This report is basically an alert sent out to the entire medical community saying, hey, be on the lookout for this.
All right, so one strange case is really intriguing. But it could just be a fluke, right? A total 1 in a million thing. So the next step in our investigation is to see if that first clue is actually part of a much bigger picture. And this is where we level up from a single report to something called a case series.
And, it's this really cool, almost organic process. One doctor writes up that first super detailed case report. It gets published or presented at a conference. Then, somewhere else, maybe hundreds of miles away, another doctor reads it and has this light bulb moment. Wow, I have a patient just like that. Then another doctor chimes in, and another. And all of a sudden, you have a collection of these cases that all seem to be connected.
And that becomes a case series, a study that looks at a whole group of patients with similar issues. It's basically a bunch of individual case reports bundled together. So now, instead of just one detective's field report, we have several detectives all reporting the same strange phenomenon. We're finally starting to see a pattern emerge from what started as just a single, isolated event.
And this really is the key difference. A case report zooms in on one patient to describe something totally new. A case series pulls the camera back to look at a group of patients to find what they all have in common. Does this weird symptom always come with a high fever? Does it only seem to affect people in a certain age group? The data shifts from being one detailed story to becoming pooled information from many stories. And that lets us find that common thread, that critical pattern.
Okay, so we've found a pattern. That's a huge step forward. But this is also where we have to be really, really careful. Case reports and case series are incredibly powerful for one thing, but they do have one major limitation. They're the spark, but they are not the fire itself. Let's look at a classic, real-world example that shows this perfectly. For pretty much the entire 20th century, the medical consensus was clear. If you had a painful stomach ulcer, it was because you were too stressed out, or maybe you ate too much spicy food. The treatment, antacids, and a bland diet. That was it. It was just accepted as fact. But then, in the early 1980s, two Australian doctors, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, started noticing something odd. They made an observation. They kept seeing this specific little spiral-shaped bacterium in stomach biopsies from patients who had ulcers.
Then they built a case series, and they found this pattern over and over and over again. This led them to ask a question that, at the time, was totally wild. What if ulcers aren't caused by stress at all? What if they're caused by a bacterial infection?
And this is so important. Those observations alone were not enough to prove cause and effect. Just because you see two things happening together doesn't mean one is causing the other. They were missing a comparison group. In other words, they knew lots of ulcer patients had this bacteria, but they didn't know how many perfectly healthy people also had it, walking around in their stomachs. Without that comparison, you can only see a possible link. You can't prove it's the cause.
And this gets to their true power. Case reports and case series are for generating a hypothesis. They are for asking powerful, game-changing questions. They grab the entire medical community by the shoulders and say, hey, everybody, look over here. We might be completely wrong about something we thought we knew. They don't give you the final answer, but boy, did they point everyone in the right direction to go find it.
So what happens next? What happens after that brilliant, totally disruptive question gets asked? Well, this is where that humble initial observation pays off in a way that can literally change the world.
The journey from that first observation was just staggering. So in the early 80s, Marshall and Warren published their case series. The medical community was, well, they were super skeptical, even critical. But their observations sparked more rigorous research, studies with proper control groups. By 1994, the evidence was so overwhelming that the U.S. National Institutes of Health officially declared that H. pylori was a major cause of ulcers and treatment needed to include antibiotics. And then finally, in 2005, the journey came full circle when they were awarded the Nobel Prize.
I mean, just think about the impact of that. For decades, ulcers were this chronic, recurring problem you just had to manage. Today, for millions of people, it's a curable infection. You take a course of antibiotics, and it's gone. That entire gigantic shift in medicine, which has improved countless lives, all happened because of this process. And that right there is the power of medical discovery. A Nobel Prize that completely transformed daily medical practice for millions of people didn't start with some billion-dollar research grant. It started with two doctors carefully observing their patients and having the courage to write down what they saw. It all began with one simple case report.
Which kind of leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought, doesn't it? Right now, somewhere in the world, in a clinic or a hospital, a doctor or a nurse is noticing something that just doesn't quite add up. They're making an observation that everyone else has overlooked. And that small, simple act of just paying attention, it might just be the very first step toward the next great medical breakthrough. What do you think it might be?